Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I'm here with the author of a book that really spoke to me. I read a lot of people online saying that this book broke them and put them back together, and I think that is a great way to phrase how I experienced this book. So without further ado, could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Well, I'm so excited to be here, Jen. Thank you for having me. And so my name is Jeffrey Dale Lofton. I am the author of Clay Suzie, my debut novel. And I grew up in Warm Springs, Georgia, and I moved to Washington, D.C. quite a few years ago, where I live now. In addition to being an author, I am a senior advisor at the Library of Congress, where I am surrounded by books and people who love books. And in short, what I think of as a kind of Eden. And so that's me. And Clay Suzie is a coming of age novel that takes the reader inside the heart and mind of a young Philbot. He is gay, physically misshapen, struggling to understand life and love in a deeply conservative family and community in rural Georgia. And it follows him from his 4th year through his 18th. In those early years, he is fueled by tomato sandwiches and green milkshakes, and during those afternoons in the garden, Granddaddy imparts life lessons that Philbot doesn't realize are life lessons, neither does the reader at first. But Philbot comes to realize that and understand and cherish that later on in life. And his world is shattered, his resilience shaken by a series of events that crush his innocence and fragile sense of security and convince him he's not worthy of being loved by Knox, who is an older boy he idolizes to distraction. But over time, Philbot finds refuge in unexpected places, in unexpected ways, leading to a resolution from beyond the grave.
It's so lovely. It was such a journey. And before we get into the book too much, I would love if you could talk a little bit about maybe where the book originated. I'm always hesitant to ask writers where they get their ideas because that's a very thorny question. But I always kind of wonder, was there an incepting image or an emotion perhaps that sort of sparked your interest in getting the story on the page?
Well, I'm happy to share that. I didn't realize I was writing Clay Suzie as a novel at first. And this is how it all started. I left home to attend LaGrange College, which is a small liberal arts institution in LaGrange, Georgia. It's only about 30 miles from where I grew up, but it was away from where I grew up, and that was the big point, the big difference. And being away had the effect of releasing some white-hot memories of the kind of about the bullying and body shaming and isolation and anger that I experienced growing up. And so by instinct, I started writing about that. It kind of saved me to be able to get that out of me. I've started to think of it as an exorcism by exposition. Mm-hmm. And so, as one can imagine, coursework got in the way. It took all of my time and energy. And so I sort of put all of that writing away. I had every intention of going back to it, but I didn't go back for decades. So fast forward to Washington, D.C., and this is when I started writing again. I read 2 books. I reread Harper Lee's Incandescent to Kill a Mockingbird, which had a more profound effect on me as an adult than it did when I was younger. And then I read Andre Aciman's Call Me by Your Name, and I didn't see the film. I still haven't seen the film, but the title of that book alone just undid me. Call Me by Your Name. And so those two books, one read after the other, had the effect of, I mean, I can only think of it as it's the power of literature for me.
Mm.
I'm sure that many of your listeners understand that power, and it just broke me open. It just completely took me back to those teenage years when I was dealing with all of this, all these feelings and experiences that I had suppressed and pushed down inside of me. They came bubbling back up again after all these years. And so I pulled out those journals and I started reading them again with all their white hot memories, you know, the raw emotion that I had put into them all those years ago. And I thought to myself, I've got to finish this. I've got to get this all out of me. So I started writing again. I finished writing it, Red Clay Suzie, on my mobile phone, going to and from my job at the Library of Congress on the subway during my commute.
Wow.
That's I take what I'd written, take the phone near the computer, and let the cloud pop it over to the computer, and I would populate what I'd written those days on the computer, and that's how I started writing again. That's how I wrote it.
That's amazing. And I am so interested in I'm really interested in books that sort of blur that line between memoir and fiction and sort of allow you to play in both spaces. And I think sometimes too that when you allow fiction into a story, it can sometimes allow you to access a sort of different kind of truth, like perhaps like an emotional truth that you want to communicate. So I'm wondering, like, as you were writing this story down, how do you balance the needs of memoir and that of fiction?
Well, it was important. It was important for me to write a novel and not a true memoir, because I wanted to explore some themes, some possible alternatives to the life that I lived, because I didn't live those. And I just thought it was, for me, a more interesting and creative process to write a fiction. So to use a literary term, it's a fictionalized memoir. And I wanted to explore some experiences, some relationships that didn't happen in particular.
One of the things that I really love that you do in this book is a really utterly vivid and really rich sense of place. And, something that I always think about is that, we tend to talk about world building when we're talking about like fantasy or sci-fi, but you're doing it too when you are writing places that exist, especially places that exist in the past. So maybe could you talk about like sort of how you evoke a sense of place that was a part of your life and then also sort of like add the fiction in? Does that make sense too?
Sure. So I did, in fact, I'm going to look for a visual aid too, although just for you, because, okay. So when you look at the title, Red Clay Suzie, well, red clay is definitely a reference to place. And in Southern literature in particular, place is often a character in and of itself. And I love Southern literature. I love how lyrical it is, how it just, the dialogue just drips with tree sap. It's musical, and I love that the quirkiness of the characters, how they inhabit this really odd world and are accepted. And I love the way that the South and Southern literature, revels in how odd those characterizations are. And so I did want to, really make a character of the red clay, and I have a jar of it here. This is in a freshly washed and dried Duke's mayonnaise jar, which is the only kind of mayonnaise you should be having anyway. And the properties of red clay, if anyone's ever experienced it, are so magical. It can take the form of, very fine and powdery like this. It can be hard as a brick because, that's what bricks are made from. When wet, the moisture content really just define its behavior. It can be gloppy like peanut butter. It can gum up anything it touches, but it also has this sort of magical property, which once it touches a person, that person is marked forever and never leaves the South. No matter where I go, wherever I travel, I'll always be a Southern writer. Part of that is because I've lived and trod the inhospitable red clay for so many years of my life. And so I did want to build a world around that. And so the first half of the book, I actually paced it to mimic the way I believe a life plays out when before you know that there's an end to life. Those days and years are so forever. A summer can last 5 years. It feels like it anyway. And so I wanted the first half to be less plot driven and more world building, character building. The red clay helped me do that. I just thought back, and when I had a jar of this and I was actually in Georgia for part of the time anyway, so I could open this or go outside and smell this and touch it and be transported back to childhood. That's how I accessed memories and feelings. That sensory detail is so important to infuse into the work. So that was about place and why the red clay is so important. How did I balance or infuse the real world into this fictional world? Well, it was intentional because there were certain relationships and experiences that I wanted to show as examples of what shaped this little boy. And I used some of my own experiences as the inspiration for the scenes that you see in the book. Now, a lot of the characters I created are, they're inspired by real people, but a lot of the characters are made up from whole cloth. And one in particular is a person who existed but didn't exist in the real world as he does in the book, and that is James, Philbot's childhood friend, all the way from their best friends from first grade all the way through high school. And James is he's insightful, he's really funny, he's wise, and he is an outsider in this world. James is Black, and he lives in a world where racism, conscious and unconscious racism, is just a fact of life. So he knows the sting of living as an outsider, just as Philbot knows the sting of living as an outsider. And they're kindred spirits in this, but they're very different in one way in particular, and that is James sees the world in such a different way. And he actually helps Philbot. He opens a door to help Philbot see the world in a much more inclusive way, as a much more inclusive place. And I did not have a friend like James growing up. There was a boy who was Black, who I in my real life wanted to be my friend, but I never approached him and asked him to be my friend. I was too afraid of rejection. I was afraid he would say no. And so writing this character, this relationship, was my way of experiencing what might have been if I'd only had the courage to act. Righting a wrong, I guess I would say.
Yeah, that is so lovely. And I think that it really does speak to the ways in which, yes, like we can sort of live our lives through literature and sort of experience alternate realities. And I think that's one of the things that makes this so powerful. Could we talk a little bit about the protagonist? Because Philbot is extraordinary. Getting to go on his sort of journey into adulthood with him is such it really does feel like a privilege. Like you're watching something beautiful happen. And one of the things that you did so well that you touched on a little bit was sort of, capturing the worldview of a child and sort of like having his worldview expand and change as he grows. Did you find yourself sort of let me start that question again. How did you capture that childhood voice? Like, how do you go back to that thing? Because a lot of the things that he notices are things that as we grow up, we are sort of trained not to notice anymore, And so how do you get back to that sort of that way of seeing?
Well, I wanted to I wanted to write a story that showed more than told. That's a very, I guess, common goal of writers, to show and not tell. And I wanted to go back to actions. So this child navigates this world, and he, it is told through his voice, but it's really his actions that show that innocence, that limited understanding of the world, because he is a child. Mm-hmm. And I observed, watching children, remembering moments from one's own childhood, or wonderful opportunities to see the world and some of its complexities in a much simpler way. So I tried to, so when I had I outlined the book, and, I wanted to do these things. I never really stuck to the outline closely, but it helped to sort of keep me in my thinking in the same world. But for example, one of my favorite scenes is the scene with when Philbert approaches Bo. And not to give away too much, but Bo is going off. He's going off to war. And Philbert is told what war is, and wonders why in the world would Bo want to go to war. And this child thinks, well, I can help change Bo's mind. I'll just explain to him what war is. So I set about trying to write a scene that in which this very young person uses his reasoning, his limited understanding of the world, to explain to this adult why he might reconsider going to war. It really was about trying to embody the heart of this character, and I rewrote and rewrote and rewrote. So it took a while to get there, but I'm glad that you think I got there.
I do. It's really lovely. And I think, one of the things I think the book communicates so well is the ways in which, family can shape our view of ourselves before we even understand that as a process, before we even know who we are. And so I think also watching the way that his worldview sort of like intersects with his greater understanding of himself is also really lovely. And I just like, this book was such a lovely gift, and thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you think you'll write another novel? Do you have anything else in the works, or are you thinking of any other projects?
I do. I have I have a rough draft of a sequel to this book. I see Red Clay Suzie as the foundation to a 3-book story arc. Mm-hmm. And I have I have a really rough draft of the next book.
That's great. I love that, because I often, sometimes when I read, I love coming of age stories, but I'm also something I always think about the genre too, is that, like, it's the end of one story, but oftentimes it's also the beginning of another, so it's really exciting just to get to think about seeing what comes next. So if you want to come back and talk about that when it's, nearing fruition too, you're welcome back to the show. So
I would love that. Yeah, this is definitely not the end of Knox's story, or this is definitely not the end of Philbert's story or Knox's story. There's more to tell. I would like for everyone to know that part of the proceeds from the sale of Red Clay Suzie go to 2 important organizations to help at-risk youth. One is the Born This Way Foundation, and the other is the Trevor Project. And those are great resources for young people who are who live their lives on the fringes, as I did when I was younger, and need help. Also, one of my goals is for Red Clay Suzie to be in every public library, whether it be, a hardcover or audiobook or digital, because I mentioned I wrote this story as a way of it was an exorcism by exposition. I started writing it for myself, but I finished writing it because I wanted to create. I finished it for other people. I wanted to create a roadmap of sorts, not a geographic roadmap where a car travels, but a roadmap inside a heart and a mind to help younger people know that there is a way to living a fuller and happier life. And I know that a lot of young people can't afford to buy books, but libraries are sanctuaries. And and there are stories there, stories that can help them navigate their worlds and their lives. That's why I'm such an advocate for libraries, and hope Red Clay Suzie and other stories can always be in libraries and available to young people.
That's extremely important. And I think those are two very worthy projects to support. And I don't think it could possibly be a more urgent time for supporting those sorts of organizations, and especially the presence of books like this in libraries. That's a really important point. Thank you so much again for joining us. This has been really lovely. Listeners, please pick up Red Clay Suzie. By the time that you hear this, it will be available. So pick it up at your library or an independent bookstore or wherever you like to get your books. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.